So welcome to another GIBS Flash Forum. Joining me today is Janice Scheckter, and she's going to be talking to us about a very, very important and relevant topic at this time. This idea of building online communities, but doing so for competitive advantage, both inside an organization and obviously outside the organization as well. So on this cool and sunny Thursday afternoon, Janice is going to talk to us about her views and thoughts around how to run this and how to make it happen. And then we're going to kind of do a bit of a Q&A about halfway through. So maybe by way of introduction, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Terry Behan. I'm a member of GIBS faculty. And if I can introduce Janice. Janice is a well-known entrepreneur and marketer. She's also worked in journalism. In the mid-90s, she founded an organization called Indigo Marketing. She then pivoted that in 2013 into another business called Indigo New Media. And I think more recently, and I think very appropriately, she has evolved that offering in her organization into Indigo Africa, which really focuses on this exact topic, this idea of building online communities and using that to develop teams on the inside and develop external communities on the outside. And I'm excited to hear about that because it's something I feel a lot of corporates and a lot of organizations are really struggling with at the moment, and how to hold teams and organizations together in these tough times. So Janice, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Terry, and hi to everyone. Thank you to GIBS for hosting this topic that I really believe, as Terry said, is so timely and so appropriate right now. So I'm going to jump to a screen share and get going. So what's really interesting is that in the States, online communities and the evolution of online communities are really far advanced. And they've done that evolution really in the last 9 years. In 2011, maybe 2010, online communities started emerging as something very tangible in a variety of organizations. And it's really cross-cutting from business to government, non-government, civil society, impact organizations, etc. So, but what's really interesting is I've been embracing that story since 2011. I was exposed to an online community in Connecticut that really involved an engineering community that was really interesting to me. And what I loved was this business engineering community overlapped with a school community, and suddenly STEM education became part of the community evolution. And that really got me going, because STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths are so lacking in our country, and there's such a gap there. But what's also interesting to me is that many here locally don't really understand what an online community is. Many think of online communities as very much a social space, a broad social media space, and it's very much not that. And it's not that drives competitive advantage. So here are just some of the organizations, most of them I believe are recognizable, that have very strong online communities, and through those communities have in fact proved competitive advantage. And I'm going to cover a little bit on what a community is, how it works internally and externally when it comes to competitive advantage, and then just lightly touch on some of these case studies, and then of course we'll go to a Q&A. So what defines an online community? If it's not social media, and it's not building the influencers, and what is an online community? So it's really, and this is my definition, it's an organization's internal and or external ecosystem connected to and engaged in shared purpose. And shared purpose sounds so NGO-ish, but it's not. People in organizations share purpose, and that purpose is defined by the organization's vision and mission. So it's very, as I said before, it's very much cross-cutting. So let's jump into how we think of community. So the internal communities and the external communities. And when we talk about ecosystems, the thinking has been for a long time that organizations need to think across their ecosystems. You know, when we stopped talking about shareholders and we started talking about stakeholders, we were talking about ecosystems. When we started talking about flattening organizations, we were talking about shared ecosystems. All these concepts interrelate. And when you think about the internal community, you think about we should have moved past those siloed structures where disciplines are really confined to themselves, where finance works in a bubble and where marketing, sales, innovation, R&D all work in their own bubbles. It's really about cross-functional, interdisciplinary thinking. And that's really about, that really talks to what the flat organization was created for. It wasn't just the flattening of the hierarchical structure. It wasn't just the removing of many levels of management, but it was also the ability to work cross-functionally. And that's what communities do. I'm going to start with alignment. And I always think that induction programs are I mean, they're there for a reason, but they really are not where people are onboarded. And if you think of yourselves as you've gone through your own, whether it's corporate lives or other different versions of organizations, you're never onboarded in an induction program. You're onboarded by your peers. That's community. I mentioned Cisco early on, and I have a lot of experience with Cisco. Cisco was a client of mine for 14 years in my marketing life. And what was really interesting in the Cisco scenario was at the time when Cisco had something like 56 buildings in Silicon Valley, and IBM ThinkPad was the device of choice. That was what was issued, but there were already some Apple lovers. And the Apple lovers didn't have access to support because the support team at Cisco supported the IBM ThinkPad, and it was a relationship. And within Cisco, community formed across these 56 buildings and across the world eventually. And the team just set up support for Apple. How do we, at the time, I don't believe Zoom existed, but we used WebEx and other technologies. And I just thought back on this with real interest to say, that's what communities are. Peers align each other, reverse mentorships where younger people start demonstrating how technologies work. Agility, and I'm very conscious always to talk about agility as opposed to agile. So yes, of course, agile can work in a community structure, but that's not the intention. It's the agility of a team. It's ensuring that someone from R&D is connecting with someone from innovation, and the someone from innovation may be talking to the external community of customers who keep on producing these ideas and giving feedback to product and new ideas to development. Institutional memory is a big one, and it goes hand in hand with knowledge management. So in the States, we're at a time when the second biggest generation, the millennials now being the biggest generation, the baby boomers are really heading into retirement, and they're heading into retirement without knowledge being captured and without institutional memory. And in the States, because they failed to do this, and I think we possibly all failed to do it, they're thinking about keeping those baby boomers back to just capture that institutional memory. But communities do this. As people develop things, they pop it into the community in different formats. It can, you know, it's not about how the tech works. It's what the intent is behind it. Knowledge management is critical, and knowledge management goes to alignment. Someone new comes onto a dev team, and there's a whole history in the community. This is what we did. This is what worked. This is what didn't work. There may be some videos, some pictures, some documents. It's about quick alignment, and that talks to agility. Retention strategy is actually a measured and proven outcome of internal communities, because when people are internally engaging, it does, of course, it doesn't stop at their work lives. It may kind of bleed off into their personal lives, and it just makes for a more holistic, wholesome engagement at a place where we spend the majority of our lives. Impact is a key one for organizations that look to drive impact, and making sure the entire organization is aligned behind that impact. You need community to do that. You need from the C-suite all the way through the organization an understanding of what we're trying to impact. And scale is of course the big one. We all look for scale in our organizations. So how do we use communities for scale? Well, when there's an accumulation of knowledge, and when we're able to collaboratively across disciplines, across functions, build bodies of evidence of work, we're able to scale quicker. As we keep building process, as we keep automating process, scale automatically happens. So I mentioned the baby boomers. What I wanted to mention was, in terms of organizational change and change management, the State of Communities report that came out of the States from an organization that runs this piece of research annually, the biggest reason that internal communities are formed is for organizational change and change management. It was something around 79% of the reason for internal communities. And then cross-functional innovation. And I'm going to share a wonderful Procter & Gamble case study with you on what cross-functional innovation looks like and how it impacts the organization. So what about external communities? And of course, there should be overlaps between the internal and the external. So external communities are created with a really broader scope of thinking. When external communities are created, it could be to measure product, to engage for the reasons of co-creation, to see innovation coming out of your organization. Starbucks, for example, created My Starbucks Ideas as their community, and they kept on tapping into that community for product ideas. There's definitely reduced customer churn because your customers feel like they're part of the organization. There's influence that comes out of your external groups, but there's more. So when we talk about competitive advantage has to always relate to aspects of cost saving. There are many organizations that have demonstrated that they've lowered their support costs. So 49% in the last State of Community report said they'd actually reduced support cost by 10 to 25%. I don't know how many of you are engaged in a community. I'm an Apple user and I'm constantly in the Apple community, and my support constantly comes from other members in the external Apple community on how to do things. R&D is another one. There are many organizations that have discovered that they've in fact de-risked their R&D by using the external community. So they might float ideas into certain champions within the community. And when we build communities, we have a lot of persona types that we identify. So it's not just one homogeneous group in the community. The innovation rate was a really interesting stat to me when I read the last report, that 67% of organizations use their community but for real insights. It's not just informing their thinking, it's actually for product development. And then, of course, most importantly is building trust. And we know that organizations go, what does community mean? Are we suddenly opening the kimono to the world? No, of course not. There'll always be things and assets within organizations that have to be kept behind closed doors. But we're in a different world today where customers want to trust the organizations they buy from, engage with, purchase from, etc. And trust is one of the biggest outcomes of both internal and external communities. So with the little time left, I'm going to talk through what's probably my favorite case study, and it actually dates back to the year 2000. So in the year 2000, P&G had really they'd lost billions in market share, and they brought in a new CEO, a guy called Alan Lafley, who over the last 20 years is the most lauded CEO of Procter & Gamble, and he actually did 2 stints. So in 2000, if you wanted a brighter smile, you could go and sit in a dentist chair in the States and pay $500. Or you could go to the dentist, have a mold made, and go to the pharmacy and buy some gel. Or you could purchase, and that was $200, or you could purchase Crest white strips for $24.99. The collaboration looked as follows. And if you look at the bottom of the infographic, the oral care division came with the teeth whitening experience. Fabric and home care brought in the bleach experience, and R&D, the film technology. This was really the result of Alan Lafley coming into an organization that had lost all this market cap. And he said, I'm going to create the most collaborative organization inside and out. And he drove cross-functional, interdisciplinary, cross-institutional. He developed 20 communities of practice. And this is probably the first and last time I heard of communities of practice within a business of this nature. And he developed these communities of practice that were really engaging. And when you look at those 3 divisions, it's unlikely that they would ever have collaborated in any innovation in any other organization had this, this intent of communities and collaboration not been introduced. So within the first year, Crest white strips proved to be a $200 million innovation, and it just went on to make a serious amount of money. Patagonia, which is fairly new in South Africa, but is an incredible brand. From the outset, this brand was really created to be a conscious brand. This is one of probably the only brand that I know that encourages you not to buy a new product. You know, there's like a badge of pride when your Patagonia hiking jacket has got holes and multiple patches from other products on it. And the Patagonia brand was always created with the intent of being environmentally conscious long before it was fashionable to do so. The community they created is exactly around that. They promote something called an earth tax, and people who buy Patagonia for their outdoor, whatever it is, guaranteed they never buy another brand. So really powerful, wonderful community. Lego is one I've also always enjoyed the story of, and this also predates the event of the growth of communities. In fact, in the late 80s, Lego had a website, and Lego was a product for kids. The site got hacked, and Lego at the time had to make a decision. Do we firewall up the site, or do we open up and see what's going on? And it was hacked, not with anything that was inappropriate, but really with people simply wanting to share their designs. Out of the hack of Lego, discovered that there was a passion for their product from artists to designers to architects way beyond the age of 8 or 10 or 12. And in time, new product was created, and the Lego community is really about this. Lego has understood for the last many, many years that engage in your community, tap into them, and really understand what they can bring in terms of product and passion, etc. So I think I've spoken quite fast, but luckily we have some time for Q&A, and yeah, I'll hand back to our moderator, Terry.
Thank you, Janice. That was interesting. I have a few questions myself, but you know what? We've got some really interesting questions coming in from our panelists. So the first one is what South African examples do you know of that are currently effective in this field? In other words, locally, would you recommend or cite any examples or case studies?
So there are very few that I've come across that are building. Obviously, we at Indigo Africa are building communities. and we're building them quite prolifically in the education space, because for organizations to really scale their impact, they're going to need communities. So we're building a lot in education. I've had really good interest from some organizations within WITS, and I'm currently running a course on communities for civil society, and I've had interest from WITS and a lot of interest from the AU. And I'm sorry to say that their interest has come about because of COVID. They're going, COVID has driven this, but actually communities are important pre, during, and post. But sorry, no great South African examples. There are no companies that have really harnessed this opportunity yet.
Well, that's not something I would, to say to our audience listening, that's not something to worry about. Thomas Friedman wrote a really good book a couple of years ago, Thank You for Being Late. And he spoke about the advantages of being a latecomer to a trend, because you can really learn from what others do ahead of you. We have a couple of more questions coming in from the audience. We've got one and two, in fact, that they're quite closely tied together. So Untokozo has asked, how can we briefly explain how we can build online communities for competitive advantage in the workplace? And Sue Swart wants to know, if we're looking at building a sort of a community, who's actually, maybe in the context of the internal environment, who's actually responsible for maintaining and driving it?
That's a great question. Both of them are really, really interesting questions. So thank you for that. I'm going to start on the end point with Sue's question, then go to Koza's question. So who's responsible? In the beginning, when at the inception of communities in the US, it was often given to the PR department. It was thought of as this marketing PR effort. And it took quite a while. And I love that you quoted the Thomas Friedman book. It's so appropriate, because it took quite a while for the guys in the US to say, actually, what we understand is that this falls under a very strategic business development arm, and that's where it should sit. Of course, the people you'd bring in, the day-to-day community curators and people who engage would be people with great communication skills, etc. But the actual strategy has to come from the highest level in the organization. It has to be driven at a strategic business decision-making level. And then to go to the strategic advantage, if you put two organizations next to each other and you had one organization tapping into their market with 100, 1,000, 10,000, 1 million champions who loved the brand and kept on giving brand feedback, as opposed to an organization that relied on the vanity metrics of what we call likes on Facebook, because that's what they are. They're vanity metrics and they're meaningless. Just think of where the competitive advantage lies, and it starts becoming clearer. If the organization, on the one hand, with the ability to act with agility in a cross-functional way, as opposed to the pretty siloed organization who are permission-driven, are waiting, you can see where the competitive advantage is. I'm going to give you one last comment on this. I hope I get my year right. In 2008, Apple launched the iPod. I may be out by a couple of years. Apple launched the iPod. Why was it not Sony? Sony had the most known mobile music device, the Sony Walkman, 12 years before. So 12-year or 13-year head start, and Sony didn't come up with something like the iPod. And the iPod, in fact, used a Sony battery. So it wasn't a complete Apple innovation. But why? Because one organization was collaborative, cross-functional, open innovation thinking, and the other wasn't.
Cool, thank you. And then and maybe just kind of expanding on the sort of ownership of it. Sort of, you said it was a sort of a PR driven. In many cases, sometimes you see that it's done by the people who have the passion for it, and that can come from any part of the organization. So if for example, I don't know, the engineering team wants, like you mentioned before, wants to spin up a community for the business, or the marketing team wants to do it. Is there any hard and fast guidelines on it, or is it something you just kind of like start and then you kind of like learn on the journey?
So there's certainly no hard and fast guidelines when it comes to the who. The what, there are definite emerging best practices. So you'll find one, a community needs a why. Why are we building? Like anything, God bless Simon Sinek, we need why. We need to answer why we're doing this. And if we don't know why we're doing it, we could get lost on the journey. But again, it could be any of the who's. The what's are the why, and then the how. So there are always different personae in a community. There are those early adopters, they want to comment, they want to blog, and then they're kind of a term that's been coined actually across the UK and the US called the lurkers. And the lurkers hang around until they trust enough and until they really feel we're ready to engage. But there's a lot to prove to these lurkers before they decide to even share a comment, never mind write a comment. So there are a lot of best practices on the what.
Okay, thank you. And then maybe sort of diverging a little bit, and there's kind of some specific questions that are quite interesting. Is the one comes in from Rusa, and the question is around: do you advise companies to hide comments on social media, or is it something they should just kind of expose and open up?
So firstly, I'm going to put it out there. I am really not an advocate of social media. I'm not an expert on it. I think that they have put profit above purpose repeatedly. And I have a real issue with that. I have an issue with YouTube, Cambridge Analytica. It's not gone away for me. I think it's not gone away for many. So I think that I'm going to take the answer in a slightly different direction. Social media becomes this free for all. It's anyone can comment. So companies should do, I don't even, I don't know the answer to what companies should do with the exposure, but communities are managed conversations. So you want to hear the bad, because if you don't hear, but it's coming from a different place. It's not coming from someone who's going to hello Peter you and expose you for everything you've done. It's someone who's there with the purpose of contributing to this organization because they like the brand or they like the business. They're two very different spaces.
Got it. Now that makes perfect sense. And I think maybe jumping to a question from Haley Allen, and she's asked around this idea: is building an online community the kind of new above the line effort? In other words, we see big brands, possibly authentically or inauthentically, trying to move into this space. So is it a trend, or do you see it as something that is sustainable?
I see it as highly sustainable and the absolute antithesis of a trend, because and it's not the replacement for advertising. It's not about advertising or brand marketing at all. It's really about engaging. So the brand marketing would come in. I mentioned Sephora, which is a big beauty brand in Europe. And Sephora have an incredible community, but they often float ideas into their community. So they may use it to engage comments. They may use it. It may in some terms replace a little bit of research and a little bit of publicity, but that's not the main aim of it. The main aim of it, and this talks to the sustainability of it, is really to build an ecosystem that will engage in different ways with the brand. And it's not merely for purchasing the brand, it's engaging with the brand.
I suppose time will tell. I think those ones, if it's inauthentic, it'll be a campaign, it'll disappear. If it's authentic, it'll stand the test of time and continue on. We have a question from Karen, and she says, do we have any concrete examples of how you might actually use this? And this is really an internal question, but how you might use this idea of building communities to, in a cross-functional context.
Yes, very much so. One of the communities that I'm currently building is for the Center for Deaf Studies at WITS. The organization is called Center for Early Hearing and Intervention. So who is the ecosystem in early hearing? There are their schools, their teachers, there are pediatricians, there are private hospitals, public hospitals, there are audiologists, there are the amplification providers like the hearing aid people. There's no organization, there's no hub that brings all of this together. The amplification partners would love to have better insights into family challenges, school challenges, audiologist challenges. The audiologists, I spoke to a few audiologists and I said, how do you feel to start with about peer-to-peer engagement? And they said, it's such a gap for us that audiologists are able to share the different challenges that families have. So that's the ecosystem are, it doesn't always come, we kind of think there's for-profit, there's not-for-profit. We keep separating these things in our mind. This is a great example where there's some NGOs, there are big for-profit businesses like Phonak, there's educational institutions, highly cross-functional.
Okay, so quite a few more questions are streaming in. I think there's a really interesting question on ethics. And I think this is this idea of the relationship between, and this is very much so an outside question. So the relationship between brands and how they kind of like tap into closed communities where there's this rich knowledge in that particular community, but and I suppose it's the relationship between the efficacy of a brand unlocking the power of a community with good intention, and then brands just driving community groups for so they can drive up their brand metrics. And your view on the balance between those and how you sort of identify one versus the other.
So I think firstly, the community that are being abused would quickly recognize it and probably not hang around for it. Communities really decide on their own direction because they're there because either they're passionate about the brand, they want to be involved in it, they want to tell Apple what the next screen should look like, or Patagonia what the next ski gloves should include. They want to do that. They have a passion for the brand. Whereas, and I love that it's come under the heading of ethics. I agree. The community that's simply tapped for knowledge and information, they'll twig that they're being used and they'll leave. So,
sure.
So the brand itself will experience one or the other.
There's a couple of questions on metrics, and I think you spoke a little bit about vanity metrics. Katleko has a question on a similar one on competitive advantage, but maybe the first one really revolves around if things like likes on Facebook, retweets are something you would term vanity metrics, then what are the more sustainable metrics that one could measure success against?
So great question. So the first thing is our community are they heading into the advocacy space? Because when they head into the advocacy space, they become the support group. How do I use? Would you suggest I buy this product or that product because I'm going traveling? So they become this advocacy group, which is real competitive advantage. People are going in, and they also become a great They talk to the product, the benefits, because they buy into it at such a level. But at the same time, for the organization, if an organization went onto Facebook and said, we'd really like to hear your thoughts on, well, you don't know the people are there, they're not there, they've liked, maybe they've joined the group, but it's such a place of mass distraction. And unless there's a reward in it, you're not quite sure that they're going to even come back. Whereas in the community, you can float the ideas. As I said, Starbucks done, Apple has done it, Patagonia has done it, Dell has done it very successfully. So the levels of engagement are different. There are some stats against it that engagement in a community where the community is quite highly evolved, so they're quite far into their maturity lifespan, can be as good as 50%, whereas compared to the broad big social media platforms, it's normally at between 0.05% and 0.1%.
Okay, and I think just building on the question that Kathleen asked, where you have clearly what you stated is when you get businesses like Apple, like Dell, like Lego, these communities are clearly a competitive advantage for them. And I think you share some of those case studies out as well, so they become part of that process. And I think there's a lot of questions coming through around sort of, how do I get this off the ground when online communities are embryonic? People don't understand them. They're new. It's like, we're in South Africa. South Africa is a massively heterogeneous society where there's limited social trust, and social contracting is weak. And how do you pull these things together from the get-go? Because I think there's a lot of people interested in this idea of, do I offer people incentives? Is it around my tone of voice? Is it just, do I spend to get a community? That's sort of initial. I think it's the case studies are fascinating because they're up and running. But there's a lot of questions from people saying, well, maybe how do I think about this from the ground up? If it's just me and my company, I now get, I think you've opened people's eyes a lot to sort of the advantages of this, but how do I get that moving from an embryonic state?
It's a long answer, which I'm going to keep really short. When you start working on the, we've developed something called the Community Design Canvas, and it starts with the why in the middle. So why are we creating it? And then it goes to the who, and the who is both who's going to champion it in the organization and who are your early champions going to be. So a community doesn't have to start with 100 people. It can start with 10 people. If 10 people prove to be good advocates and want to engage with you, the rewards of engagement may simply be recognition. And often in the space, we've seen social recognition, social badging, TripAdvisor, you post a comment and you're a senior contributor after 10 place reviews, and that's what we call social badging. And badging in communities works in a very similar way. So once you've identified the who internally, there might be 10 people who are close to your organization who simply want a weekly Zoom with a team that includes some senior people. And that could be the start of a community. So it's about designing the stakeholder ecosystem, seeing what you want, why you're doing it, and then starting to design the engagement. I've started a number of communities from scratch, and there are always people in the organization who get it, and more importantly, there are more people who don't. So we have a case to prove.
Two more questions, I think, and then we'll kind of start to close out. One is a really interesting one, I think, given the fact that we're a learning institution as GIBS as well, which is your view on this idea of social learning networks and platforms as proxies for communities, and how maybe learning networks specifically can be leveraged to create communities and vice versa. And I think in the context of South Africa, that's a really really valid question. If you look at the sort of the bridge in terms of skills gaps, you spoke in your narrative about in North America, them trying to bring baby boomers back to work because they have knowledge that they hadn't shared out before they left. I think we have a similar challenge in South Africa. We've got such a big divide in our society in terms of income, and to a certain extent formal education as well. And how do you think about those learning systems and learning networks as a way to bridge those gaps?
I think that's absolutely huge, and I'm working on a number of those. And I think in South Africa, we have such an interesting scenario where we've got a number of people who may have retired because we were transitioning a country in terms of giving previously disadvantaged people opportunities, and we have this huge a resource, or this huge cohort of people out there who really could be contributing to knowledge communities. I think it's a massive opportunity. So for example, let's take, and it's off the top of my head, look at Eskom and all the issues they've gone through, and think about all the engineers who are retired who could have been contributing to knowledge communities.
Maybe just to take it internally one last time is, Sue Swart has a question around, to what extent does culture and leadership of an organization impact and influence the uptake of these type of communities? And is there any differentiation between a hierarchical business and a flat business? Does it matter? Because I think a lot of people that who are with us on this Flash forum would be really interested in going back into their business to initiate this conversation. And they may have some apprehension around sort of doing it depending on the kind of leadership culture that exists within those businesses.
I think it's really important culture, because if the culture is a particularly closed culture where information is not freely shared, communities are going to be more of a challenge, not impossible, more of a challenge. So you're really looking for an open culture of sharing, of freedom of information to some extent. Again, no organization can completely share everything. Flat versus hierarchical, the flat organization finds it easier to build community, because in the hierarchical, often the top of the hierarchy doesn't believe that they have a part to play. And it's important that leadership are involved in communities.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. We're kind of running out of time. I thought this was really fascinating. I think certainly what I took out of this was, look, we all understand being part of these kind of amorphous communities like Apple and dev communities and design communities. But you've really given a shape to the impact that they can have, and to a certain extent, there's a sort of numerical advantage to doing that. So as much as we talk community is in fact quite a competitive advantage. So just maybe to close out, Janice, if people want to kind of connect with you or learn more about this, where can they go to find out information?
They can go to, and our site is 3 days, our new indigo.africa site is 3 days from ready, but indigo.africa.
Okay, so indigo.africa, when lockdown level 3 starts, it'll be up and running by the sounds of it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share your real wealth of knowledge and experience with us. I think it's been incredibly valuable. And to those that participated, thank you for joining us. And we would always, as always, welcome you to attend any of the Flash forums that we have at GIBS. And please keep an eye out on our social channels and on our website. To those online, thank you very much. Janice, to you, thank you very much. And I guess we'll leave it there.
Fabulous, thank you.